All right. Well, thank you, Kimberly, and welcome everybody. I'm Jill Menze, news editor at PhocusWire, and I am very thrilled to welcome our guests today. We have Blair Taylor, who is Managing Director of Talent and Organization and North American Lead Inclusion and Diversity at Accenture. He also has a notable background working for some major brands, including PwC and Starbucks. So Blair, thank you so much for joining us today.
Hey, Jill, it's my pleasure to be here with you. Thank you so much for having me. Really appreciate it.
Great. So I want to start this off by sort of framing the theme for our conversation, which, as Kimberly mentioned, it's how the persistent reality of hope helps us thrive. And this idea of the persistent reality of hope actually came from a post you wrote on LinkedIn back in February. I'm hoping you can start us off by kind of explaining why you wrote that post earlier this year, and if you've seen any notable changes in the environment in the months since you've written it.
Yeah, well, listen, we're living through an incredible moment in history, and one of the things that I'm a student of history, and I often observe that throughout history, people have quite often missed their moment in history. Tens of thousands of Americans, for example, lived through the civil rights era and didn't realize that it was a huge moment in history until 20 years later, when they look back on it and said, my gosh, I lived through one of the incredible moments of American history. And part of the reason for that, Jill, is people get so focused on the problems of their era that they really don't see the opportunities. And in so doing, you can actually miss your moment. And think about the era that we're living through now. You've got this, this balance of humanity and technology, which is something that we've never seen before and is moving faster and faster every year. We've got massive social challenges, from economic challenges and racial injustices and all the things we've seen over the last 18 months, to things like environmental issues. And all of these things are facing us. And quite frankly, just to put a pin in this and we can come back to it, all of them are screaming for corporate intervention and corporate involvement to help find solutions. And at the same time, we've got, government receding in public opinion polls and trust being diminished in our traditional institutions that led the way for change in the 20th century. And quite frankly, if you're in a corporation right now, which I think most of the people who are listening are, we have resources, we have technology, we've got people who are chomping at the bit to get involved. And we also probably, most of us, have a mandate from our stakeholders to do something different, to innovate in this period that we're living through. And I think about my area of focus, which is, as you said, diversity, equity, inclusion. And diversity, equity, inclusion in organizations used to be an appendage in organizations. About 40 years ago, it wasn't until companies started to recognize that people mattered 40 years ago. And that took 20 years for that to really set in. And then about 25 years ago, corporations started to realize that, people's differences mattered. And we're still in that period where we're figuring some of that out. And it wasn't more than, say, 18 months ago that corporations in mass, and I mean on a macro level, really started grappling with, hey, we may have a role in social change and economic inequality. And that journey is just underway now, and corporations are starting to recognize that they have a role there. And the reason why all that's important is, this is a huge historical opportunity for any of us who are in corporations, who are part of that fabric, because corporations will have an incredible role. I'm not saying that they will have all the answers, so don't misinterpret this. I'm saying they will have an incredible role in change from what we do going forward. And to me, that's an exciting era. That's an era of hope. That's an era of opportunity. And I think it's one that, quite frankly, we've never seen before. I've been doing work in diversity, equity, inclusion for a quarter century. I've never seen a moment like this before. And I'm optimistic, because I think all of the problems that we face can actually be solved.
Absolutely. Yeah, let's dig into a little bit more deeper on what you are seeing. And because you look at a corporation balancing any number of priorities, Yes, they're starting to take this more seriously. It's becoming much more of a business case. But you've talked before about this idea of perceptible shifts, because not all of this can be accomplished at once. Can you talk a little bit about some of those perceptible shifts you've seen up close in corporate America, and give some examples? And then, how can, for those of us listening, think about that similarly to build a similar type of momentum?
I love the question. And let me tell you, one of the things I've seen that I think is a perceptible shift is companies are starting to recognize that they have both an internal play in terms of things like diversity, equity, inclusion, for example, and an external play. They have a responsibility to do things that are outside of their four walls, if you will. How do you get involved in making your community a better place? How do you get involved with opening doors of opportunity for those who may not have had those opportunities prior to your involvement? How do you uplift, communities in a way that will enable them to thrive over time? And the interesting thing about that, and it is a change. I mean, because now companies are starting to think about this. Okay, we've got our people. How do we treat our people well? How do we create an environment of inclusivity? But at the same time, what can we do to make the world a better place? It's sort of the concept of doing well and doing good, right? Because it ends up being a virtuous circle. If companies can actually get outside of their four walls and think about how do we make the world a better place, that ends up being something that attributes or inures to the benefit of that company over time. Why? Because it turns out that in the 21st century, the workforce, particularly the millennial workforce, is looking for companies that are doing things to make the world a better place. So it turns out that that's a competitive advantage in recruiting. If you're doing those things, you have an advantage. If you're not doing those things, you're at a distinct disadvantage. I think that's a palpable shift in what companies are starting to do, what they're starting to think about today. And quite frankly, as I said earlier, it's precisely what the world needs at this moment in time. And so companies are awakening to that at the board level, at the C-suite level, and we're seeing things starting to move in a way that I've never seen before. And that's exciting.
That's great. That's great. Can you talk a bit about how you personally have placed yourself in situations that we call intentionally uncomfortable? It's hard to walk in someone's literal shoes unless you've quite literally been in them. Can you share some of what you've done in your own experience to make yourself in that intentionally uncomfortable place, and how we can do something like that in a practical sense within our own businesses or personally?
Yeah, Jill. So the concept of being intentionally uncomfortable, let me just unpack that for a second, because the notion there is it's all in the realm of trying to gain empathy for somebody else, right? And in that process of trying to gain empathy, this notion of making yourself intentionally uncomfortable is very important. First, let's start with empathy. Why do you want to gain empathy? We want to gain empathy because that's a pathway to gaining understanding about other people, right? And so if you think about gaining understanding with other people, that's the pathway to us gaining an authentic voice. Like, I can't really talk about somebody else's issues, problems, opportunities if I haven't sort of walked in their shoes as much as I can. And so the pathway to gaining an authentic voice is a pathway that goes through empathy. Well, guess what? If we don't have an authentic voice, and if we don't have empathy, and we don't have an authentic voice, it becomes very hard for us to tell stories. We're a storytelling culture. We have to have stories as leaders to be able to have those who are behind us in an organizational structure or any other scenario to actually follow our lead. And think about it. One of the big things that I think has been missing from the movement around diversity, equity, inclusion over the last 25 years is this notion of gaining empathy for others, walking in their shoes, if you will. Now, that leads us to this notion of making yourself intentionally uncomfortable, because the reality of it is, I say to people all the time, if you've never been the only one in the room, right? Then you don't know what that feels like. Guess what? I've been a senior executive in corporate America for many years, and I'm the only one in the room almost every single day. And as an African American leader in corporate C-suites, and if you've never been the only one in the room, is there a way for you to really relate to the feelings that I have, or the feelings that somebody who is a person with a disability may have, or the feeling that somebody who's from the LGBT community may have. Like, you have to figure out ways to make yourself intentionally uncomfortable. Let me just tell you a real quick story. So a few years back, a family friend wanted to go to church with my family. And this person had never been to a Black church. We happened to be attending an all Black church. And she said, I want to go to that church. I want to see and experience what it's like. Now, many people would say, I don't want to be the only white person in an all Black church. Like, I don't want to have that feeling. That's too uncomfortable for me. And this person said, no, I want to go. And she went and she experienced it. And guess what? It demystified what that experience was like. She came away, and the next time I saw her, literally she was driving down the street with the church tape in her, or the church CD in her car, and she was listening to the music from the church. And she had experienced that, and that had opened up her mind to make her more comfortable for future experiences. And so we have to think about ways to make ourselves the only one in the room. We have to think about ways to make ourselves intentionally uncomfortable, because it's part of the pathway to empathy. And without that, it becomes very hard for a leader, even if they intellectually get the concept of diversity, equity, inclusion, even if they understand all the numbers and the statistics that we went through at the top of this broadcast. All of that may be true, but if they don't have an authentic voice, if they can't tell stories about the experiences they've had with people who are not like them, it will be very challenging for them to get others to follow. And that's the point about gaining empathy and understanding that's so important. And it's also the point about, allowing yourself, finding opportunities to make yourself intentionally uncomfortable, because that's part of the process. It's a hard process. It's not easy, right? That's part of the reason why it hasn't happened, right? But companies need to think about ways to do it, and we as individuals need to think about ways to do it.
Can you give some examples of ways that companies can do this? We see a lot of social responsibility programs in the end. You can encourage your employees through volunteer hours, things like that, which are all great ways to go about this. But, really cultivating that genuine empathy, looking at it from a corporate level, what can we do to start to try and build that?
Yeah, I really appreciate that question, because, if we're talking at 25,000 feet, it's not helping anybody, right? I mean, we got to get down and make this real and practical. So I'm a storytelling guy. Let me tell another story.
Absolutely.
A few years ago, I was the chairman of the board of the United Way out in Seattle, where I live. And the United Way runs an event every year, which is an event for people who happen to be homeless. And every year, now you can imagine this happens at the stadium where the Seahawks play. And every year, 2,000 plus homeless people show up to this event. So there are literally lines out the door. The beauty of it is 400 plus corporate volunteers also show up at this event. And when a person who happens to be homeless walks through the door, they're greeted by an individual with a clipboard. And that person says, what services do you need today? Now imagine a room filled up with services. If you need to get your hair cut, if you need to get a mammogram, if you need to get an internet address, if you need a new pair of shoes, if you need a job, there's literally dozens and dozens of these stations all over the floor of the event. Now the corporate person meets the homeless person and has a one-on-one exchange with that person, right? Now this may be a leader from corporate America who's never talked to a homeless person before. Mm-hmm. They have this one-on-one exchange. They say, what services do you want today? Person says, I want to do this, this, and this, and they go through the list. Then that corporate executive or corporate representative takes that homeless person around to the stations for the next hour. If they want to sit down, there's a lunch station where they can sit down and have a conversation over lunch. I've done this over and over again. I've talked to literally dozens, if not hundreds, of corporate executives who've been through it. And you know what? To a person, every single one that's been through that experience says, I will never view homeless people the same way again, because it has now personalized them. They realize that homeless people have a
I think The sound cut out.
Can you still hear me?
Okay, now I can hear you. Yes.
Oh, I'm sorry. I lost your image too, but hopefully you're still there. So homeless people are people, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the vast majority of them have had something in their life that was a massive setback. And when you actually humanize them, when you actually have a moment to understand there but for the grace of God go I, first of all, and secondly, there is something that I can do to help you, to engage with you, and to humanize you. And those corporate executives walk away from that event, including me, by the way, because I didn't have a lot of experience with people who are homeless before that I went through these events. And you recognize that when you see a homeless person, when you have an experience with a homeless person, you're looking at it through a different prism. Many of those people are people who had one bad instance in their life. One young man literally was a truck driver. He had a great job. He had a great income. He was 22 years old, and he went out and he got drunk one night, and he woke up the next day, and he decided he was going to drive his truck even though he was still hungover. And he went out and he got pulled over. He lost his license, and he didn't have any family, and he didn't have any friends in the community where he was living, and he was homeless. And there's story after story after story like that. And what you realize is, hey, now when my company wants to focus on people who are homeless or solving the homeless crisis, I have stories. I can talk about it in a way that conveys empathy, that actually can convince people I believe what I'm seeing. I am excited about it, and I'm interested in it. I'm interested in solving the problem that people who are homeless face. And so that's a real example of how do you get from the concept, right, to actually engaging. Now, that can be done with young people coming from disadvantaged communities. That can be done with people who are homeless, happen to be homeless. That can be done with people with disabilities. I mean, there's a whole spectrum. When I was in corporate America in a C-suite role, I had the opportunity to work with the employee resource groups, and I specifically assigned myself to the group with people with disabilities. Why? Because I didn't know much about people with disabilities. Didn't mean I didn't have a heart there. I just didn't know much about their lives and the issues and the troubling things that they might go through. And after a year of leading that ERG or employee resource group, I gained an understanding of their issues. I became a champion. I helped solve some of the issues that they faced because I said, my gosh, I didn't know that. I didn't understand that. I remember talking to a veteran once and having a conversation with a veteran. And I had never really sat down with a veteran and had a conversation. And the veteran said to me, listen, what people often do with us is they pass us by. And he said, if I've had 2 tours in overseas and I've come back, I mean, just ask me how I'm doing. Just take a moment and say, how are you? Right. And you think about something as simple as that, but that admonishment helped me because I never met a veteran who I passed in the hallway and I knew that they were a veteran without saying, how you doing? How are you? Are you okay? Right. And so it's breaking down those misconceptions. It's demystifying populations. That's the pathway here. And corporations can do it through volunteerism. They can do it by assigning executives to be mentors of certain groups or populations within their workforce. They can do it by going outside of the company, outside of the organization, and engaging with, maybe HBCUs or other organizations where populations exist that you might want to be supportive of. So there's a whole litany of ways. But the point is, you've got to come out of your comfort zone, and you've got to reach out and then think about a structured way as a corporation or organization of helping your executives, your leaders, and others in your organization to gain empathy.
Absolutely. I think that particularly resonates with travel because, travel executives need to not only understand what their employees are going through, but also the customers that they serve, which could not be more diverse because of the nature of travel. That's what we're trying to gain an understanding of. So I think it's definitely applicable to the travel space as well.
It is. And you know, what's interesting is the customers are now starting to insist that companies do more of this, right? And that's the interesting moment back to the era we're living through. It's not the same as it was when I came out of college before electricity, way back when. You know, I wasn't asking what's your company doing to make the world a better place. That wasn't on my checklist. I'm
Right.
sorry, I admit it, right? Nor was I making a selection of what brands I would buy based on what they were doing for the environment or what they were doing to make the world a better place or what they were doing to uplift communities. Guess what? We're living in an era where consumers are making choices based upon what a company is doing to make the environment better, to make communities better. That matters today. And so if you're not paying attention to this, you're going to miss out from a business perspective. Listen, I often make the analogy, and I'll stop after I say it. I often make the analogy with respect. People say, well, what's the era like we're living through with diversity, equity, inclusion? Here's the analogy I often make. It's very similar to what we went through with the advent of the internet 25 years ago, a little more than 20 years ago. And what I mean by that is the advent of the internet, there were many companies that said, I don't need to pay attention to this internet thing. I'm going to keep selling my books the way I always have. I'm going to keep renting videos the way I always have. And guess what? Those companies that didn't pay attention to the internet, many of them aren't around today. They're gone. They're gone from the landscape. They were big companies and they don't exist. Similarly, if you fast forward to today, companies that pay attention to diversity, equity, inclusion, I mean internally and externally, as we've talked about, companies that say, I'm going to weave this into the fabric of who we are, just like those companies that did that with the internet 20 years ago. Those are the companies, and I don't have a crystal ball, but I have a pretty good sense of history. Those are the companies that will thrive and be the most successful companies over the next couple of decades. Why? Because the environment has shifted. It's a palpable shift. If you're ignoring this, you're ignoring a future. And I just don't think that that's possible to be successful if you're not paying attention to those things.
Absolutely. Right. So we've got a few more minutes, and I kind of want to go back to the post we were talking about on the persistent reality of hope. And back in February, you wrote, "Hope has never been more at risk. However, it's also never been more important." Would you say that you still believe hope has never been more at risk, or how do you think we are progressing now that we have moved through much of this year?
Yeah, you know, I think we're living through an incredible period, both because of the opportunity and because of the risk, right? And therefore, you know, the hope and the optimism becomes more important than ever. Look, you know, as I started, I'll repeat myself a little bit, but I will say we're living through a very, very challenging era. The challenges can be overwhelming, right? But what I often say to people is think macro and act micro. So think about the problems at a macro level, but then bring it down to a micro level. What can I do to change my neighborhood? What can I do to change one person's life before 2021 runs out? What can I do on a micro level in the department that I lead in this corporation? What can I do to influence my peers to make our company more socially responsible? All right, that's the macro things can be overwhelming. The micro is where we need to take action, and in those micro activities, when you string them together, there's the hope, there's the change, there's the ability to actually influence our future and make ourselves feel like we're relevant. Listen, I am a big believer we're all living lives of consequence. There's not a single person who's listening to my voice who isn't a leader in some way, right? And we have to look at ourselves as leaders. Every single day, you've got to get up and say, I'm a leader. What am I going to do to lead today? I actually believe that the era we're living through, we're going to make it through. We're going to thrive and survive and do well. But guess what? That doesn't have to be the case. Like you know, this notion that somehow America or other advanced countries are going to emerge at the end of this century the same way that we looked at the end of the last century, that's not written in that's not cast in concrete, right? That's up to us. We've got to defend this. We've got to be proactive in spite of all the divisiveness, in spite of all the issues and things that are going on. Each of us has a responsibility. And the interesting thing is, back to what I said earlier, we're on the platforms that actually should be the leaders of change through this era. And so I think that is an awesome place. And does that give hope? It should, right? Because if the problems are solvable and you are actually part of the fabric of where the solution should come from, that should infuse us all with a lot of hope. So yes, there's things that can get you down. There's reasons for people to be discouraged. I say look up and see the possibilities. I really do, and I mean that. And from a corporate perspective, there has never been a more important time for companies to step forward, and companies have never been better resourced or had a bigger incentive to do so than they do right now. And that's across every industry, maybe especially in the travel industry that you're talking about.
Absolutely. Great. Well, unfortunately, we're out of time. I know we could keep going and going. This has been wonderful, Blair. Thank you so very much for sharing your insights. I'm sure we will have people now Googling your LinkedIn post and finding out more, and that's been great. So,
well, thank you so much. And I just want to, before we sign off, I just want to acknowledge two of my colleagues who are on, Karina and Kathy, and of course, all of us will be available for anyone who has questions or comments. So thank you so much for having me. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Blair.